The masses never revolt of their own accord, and they never revolt merely because they are oppressed. Indeed, so long as they are not permitted to have standards of comparison, they never even become aware that they are oppressed. And this week's opening quote comes from George Orwell. Welcome to Surviving the Matrix, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Maxwell Egan. It's a pleasure to be with you once again, and I will be your host for the next hour. Now, as you might have noticed, in the last 12 months or so, I'm putting a reasonable amount of focus on history, on the fact that our history has very likely been changed. Most of it appears to have been fabricated. And I've put out a number of videos on this topic recently. Quite a few of them have actually been deleted by YouTube. So what I'm going to attempt to do today is kind of summarize what I've figured out so far, and at least attempt to share with you some sort of a nutshell version of where the research has taken me. And this has been an ongoing quest. It's what got me started on this journey way back when I was a child, when I was 8 years old, and I discovered that they didn't know how they built the pyramids. And it's kind of been a hobby that I've had for my whole life, attempting to discover what's been going on. But it wasn't until recently that I became aware that the timeline has actually been changed. And it really answered so many questions when I discovered the work of Anatoly Fomenko. And not that I agree with everything that Fomenko has said in his books that he's put out. He's put out a series of books called History, Fiction or Science. I don't agree with everything, but I certainly agree with his notion that the timeline has been changed. And it's not just Fomenko that has suggested this. Many people have suggested it beforehand. And with some of the revelations that we've had in the last few years, the revelation of Tartaria, the revelation of the Earth being repopulated with children, and the concept of a cyclic cataclysms, things have really started to fall into place. Many pieces of the jigsaw puzzle that we couldn't find seem to have all fallen into place, and now we are actually able to build some sort of a coherent picture of what is actually going on here. And of course, it's very different to what we're being told by mainstream academic circles. As seems to be always the way, folks, they just don't like to inform people about what's really going on. And of course, there is a reason for that. A lot of people would think, why? Why would they bother fabricating history? Why wouldn't they want us to know? But really, when you look at some of the cycles it appears that this Earth goes through, then it becomes quite understandable why they wouldn't want people to know, because people would simply not be doing the things that they're doing now. You wouldn't be able to get people to participate in this ridiculous slavery system, this ridiculous economic system, if they knew what was really going on here. By fabricating history and by fabricating the rise of feudal empires through history and the rise of democratic governments, everything that they portrayed to us, it kind of creates the excuse as to why the world's in the situation that it's in. It provides the necessary backstory for people to simply accept their servitude. And so it makes a lot of sense for the powers that believe they be to have done this and to have presented a completely false history to people. As I've often said, if you don't know your history, then you don't really know who you are. You don't know what your roots are. You don't know where you came from. As said by Marcus Garvey, and I've said this quote many times, a man with no history is like a tree with no roots. And it is so true. A knowledge of our history is imperative to have a knowledge really of who we are. Some people may not think that is the case, but really it is the case. Most especially when you look at just how much has been covered up and you look at the potential and possibilities of what actually may have come before. Now, as I've mentioned to you before, there's every indication that societies pre-1900, or even perhaps up until 1900, had free energy. You can find video footage still. You can find video footage of the San Francisco tram system, and you can see trams running without overhead lines. They seem to be getting their power through the tracks or from some other means. There is certainly no wires above the trams. What there is on top of the trams is their two little conical devices which almost look like little Tesla devices. So you've got to wonder if that was the source of the energy, or, as I said, whether they were getting it through the tracks. But it doesn't seem right that it would be through the tracks, because obviously you're not going to have electrified tracks for people to walk on. So you've got to question what the power source of these trams was. We've looked at the concept of old cathedrals and churches quite likely being power stations and being used to generate free electricity, much the way a crystal radio set works, because it's all crystal structure, crystal and copper wires, and all of the elements within a crystal radio set can also be found within a church and a cathedral, and there's every indication that that's what these were used for. They were actually power stations used to generate free electricity, and that electricity was quite common in the world prior to the 1900s. We find many depictions from the old World's Fairs that seem to show what appear to be electrical devices. Most particularly the 1897 Chicago World's Fair is just awash with what looks like electrical inventions all over the place. It almost appears that this was a place where they gathered all of the lost Tartarian technology, all of the old Tartarian technology, and kind of put it all together for one big viewing before they just destroyed it all and took it all out of public knowledge. We find depictions of buildings on plaques that I've shown you before from Holland that show buildings producing free electricity. These same plaques also show men having tournaments with what appear to be electrical weapons, such as electrical swords. We also find many depictions of electrical weapons being used in warfare in the 1800s as well. We find reports of how warfare was changed in the 1800s due to the introduction of the electric machine gun, the electric cannon. We find depictions of such devices. We find that there was a European electric cannon, there was a Japanese electric device as well. We've also found depictions from World War I of what appear to be sound devices that were used for perhaps even creating something like a mud flood. Mud was very prominent in World War I. If you read any report of World War I, you'll find that mud is pretty well the most prevalent thing in the war. In fact, there was so much mud, it was even difficult dropping bombs on people from aircraft because the bombs would simply land in the mud and they wouldn't explode. So there's every possibility that that's what these churches were. They were actually power stations, but not just power stations. And we've also looked at the concept and the possibility that the organs that are found in these churches may well have actually been used for sound healings, and the very real possibility that many of these so-called churches and cathedrals were not in fact places of worship, but they are in fact places of healing. And that may seem pretty out there to some people, but there's every indication that this is what was going on. A lot of people in the modern world even go to sound healings today, so we know how beneficial sound can be for the human organism. And we also are aware that they once changed the key of music. They raised it from 432 cycles up to 440 cycles, which would have created everything that we listen to now to be slightly discordant with the ambient background of the Earth. And of course, just becoming aware of this, one needs to question the reason that this would have been done as well. I mean, you think about it, if sound is used to heal, and if all of the structures that we'd built were built in accordance with the ambient background sound of the Earth, the ambient frequency of the Earth, what would happen if you changed all of our music? Would that not induce some form of sickness or disconnection within the human condition? Indeed, may that even be a way of reducing the human lifespan. If you look at ancient texts and they talk about people living easily for 300 years, could that be because of the resonant frequencies around them? Could that have something to do with it? It's an interesting question. And there is a possibility, of course, that you could tie this in with the focus that was once put on our brainstem, on our pineal gland, on the inner workings of the human mechanism. There seems to be a huge focus on this, folks, in so much ancient architecture, so many ancient statues. Even when you look at the statues in Egypt, as I mentioned to you, I think 3 or 4 shows ago when I talked about the work of a friend of mine called Chance Gardiner, who has been looking at Egyptian statues and realized that many of the statues, even the Egyptian headdresses, appear to be depicting human brain stems. As I mentioned before, even Michelangelo's depiction of God on the roof of the Sistine Chapel appears to depict a brain stem within the neck of God. So There seems to be a real focus that was put on the human brainstem and the power of what we can achieve through the application of consciousness into this 3D reality that we live in. And this seems to be a focus of many cultures, folks. It isn't just the Egyptian culture. When you look at the Vedic cultures, you look at all ancient societies, even when they brought you texts that were related to war or government or the rulers or history or anything, there was always a very spiritual overtone to the whole thing. Many people have thought, oh, this is mystery school stuff and New Age teachings and blah, 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 but really it's not. It's simply a common thread that seems to run through so many ancient cultures, that there was a real effort to make sure the importance of spirituality and the importance of human consciousness was stressed through all of their teachings. And this is something that's very absent from the modern world. This sort of stuff is pushed to the side, and we're taught that it's got no real value in the economic world. What is valuable is good business sense and all the sort of stuff that they put us through, folks, all of which leads us away from any real understanding of humanity and of the reason for the current human condition. And I'd suggest there's a reason for that, folks. And in fact, that this lack of focus is something that's very responsible for the state of the human condition. But even with the way this is pushed into the background with Western society, it's still quite there. You can see it's still quite visible throughout all aspects of Western society. Just look at our religious organizations and look at for example, the Court of the Pine Cone in the Vatican. You look how the pineal gland is there on a statue. Do you really think this was put there by the Vatican, or was this put there by a previous culture? Was it put there by the Tartarian culture? Why does the Pope still carry around a staff with a pineal gland on the end of it? Would he be doing this simply because the Vatican is hiding up the fact that they've calcified our pineal gland? Or is it simply the fact that they picked up the remnants of the old culture and they started promoting the wrong concepts about reality, but just using the same tools to do it? But you can see it's there. Why would the Pope be carrying around a staff with a pineal gland on the end of it if the pineal gland was not something that was absolutely integral to the human condition? And that's an important part to look at. It's an important thing to take note of with all of the ancient teachings regarding this spiritual connection that we once had, is that there is also a huge amount of focus put on human biology. Like I said, it isn't just consciousness. It's on the brainstem. It's on the pineal gland. It's on things that we have within our biology which we can activate in order to take consciousness to a new level, or at least take us back to the level that we're supposed to be at. You've got to ask, why is the pineal gland calcified? And this is what fluoride does, folks. It's one of the main things fluoride does. And you might say, well, we live in a country where there is no fluoride in the water. But even if there is no fluoride in your water, folks, I guarantee it's in the salt. It's in the canned food. It's in other stuff. It's in everything else. They're making sure they're getting it into you so that this pineal gland is closed. But the fact that there is a biological connection to the levels of spirituality we could actually be reaching is a very profound thing, and it's a very encouraging thing, because it shows that it isn't really that difficult for us to regain the connection that we once had. As I've said to you before, it may be as simple as changing our diet and getting our biology back in order to bring ourselves back online. What we're likely able to achieve through the application of consciousness, if we could only just understand what consciousness is. If we could get some focus back on this, I think whole new worlds would open for us, ladies and gentlemen, the way these worlds were once open for us. But all of these sorts of things are being rediscovered now. People are starting to pay attention to history, and many people are realizing that there is so much wrong with what we've been told, and that the evidence is actually all around us. And it's been very encouraging to see this sort of thing happening. Something else that's very much come to people's attention and has been coming to prominence in research is the concept of what we're calling the mud flood, for want of a better term. Again, the concept of these reoccurring cataclysms, and attempting to discover what it was that has buried so many buildings right around the world, at least 12 feet, sometimes more than 12 feet, 12 to 18 feet, sometimes even more, in a layer of soil. And new roads have been constructed, new entrances have been constructed, the below level areas have simply been sealed off and forgotten about, and nobody's been told they are there. This is very strange, folks, because this is being found all across Europe. It's been found in Australia, it's been found in the United States, it's been found in England, all around the world, and there's simply no record of this in the history books. And many of these buildings are, relatively speaking, quite modern buildings that have been constructed within the last 200 or 300 years, and they seem to be buried in a layer, which, as I said, is not accounted in our history books. And if you'd like to know more about the mud flood, there is a channel that I've mentioned to you before. I think he's a Russian guy by the name of Philipp Druzhinin, and he covers a lot of ground on the mud flood. He's done a lot of research into it. He's gone to a lot of places. And if you're watching this on YouTube, I'll be sure to put a link to his channel in the video description below. And these sorts of discoveries very much support the notion of reoccurring cataclysms and of fabricated history. And we're finding all sorts of remnants of previous cultures that we hear, folks, and not just the ancient cultures. You know, when you talk about previous cultures, people will automatically think of things such as the pyramids or Alexandria or the Colosseum or the ancient walls in Peru, Sacsayhuaman, places like this. But within our own cultures and within our own cities and within our own societies, there are remnants of quite civilized cultures that existed there prior to modern society ever being formed. I mean, we've got buildings here in Australia which simply cannot be explained by convicts coming here and building them, not in the amount of time they had to do it. And we're finding that this same culture can be found all around the world. We're finding what is termed to be Greco-Roman style architecture in virtually every country on Earth, here in Australia, in the Philippines, across Europe, even in Japan, in the Americas, in Brazil, Argentina, everywhere. And we're also finding remnants of what we are terming to be the mud flood all over the earth, finding it across Europe, finding it in America, even finding it here in Australia. As I said, buildings that are buried in 12 to 18 feet of mud with whole floors below that we don't know about. There's also some very strange remains that can be found around the United States, which appear to have been left by previous cultures as well. As I pointed out to you previously, the sewer system in San Francisco really is remarkable. This is a multi-level, multi-story sewer system, which is huge. I mean, it's the size of the city, this sewer system, and it would have been years in the construction. Why is there no record of this ever being constructed? It's quite remarkable. Where would they even have got all the bricks to construct it at the time they did? And when we hear the stories of the gold rush and the way San Francisco was apparently founded, the construction of this sewer system simply isn't taken into account. This would indicate that there was a culture prior to this one that constructed that sewer system, and there's every indication that this culture was Tartarian in nature. We've also found things across the United States like aqueducts, which are found all across the United States, which are built in a very European Roman, we're told, style. These styles are depicted as being Greco-Roman, but we really don't know why they would use that term. I mean, why would there be people who are colonizing the United States building Greco-Roman style aqueducts? Greco-Roman also appears to be a cover story for Tartarian infrastructure. But not only that, it's not just these structures such as the sewer system in San Francisco and the aqueducts that can be found in the southern United States. There's a whole bunch of areas around New Haven, around Atlantic City, around the whole New York, New Jersey area, which appear to depict old canal estates. And these are areas that are considered to be wetlands and considered to be protected areas, areas where nobody really goes, and areas where there's certainly never been any population. And yet when we look at these areas, we find parallel lines, we find parallel canal lines, and we find what appear to be canal estates, or at least the remains of canal estates that appear to have once existed along the edge of these islands or along the coast of New York and New Jersey in some places. I mean, it's very, very strange that these lines and these apparent remains of ancient estates would be there. And very, very intriguingly, even on the ground in some of these places, we find the remains of old power lines. And these look like power lines from the 1920s or 1930s, but again, these are in areas where there was supposed to have never been any people. And we didn't even have electricity until the late 1800s, so what are these power lines doing in these places? It really doesn't make a lot of sense, not if what we're presented with as being modern history is to be believed. Something else that has recently been brought to my attention and that I mentioned to you, I think, either on last week's show or the week before, is the fact that maps of the United States prior to the mid-1600s do not depict the Great Lakes on any of their maps. The Great Lakes do not appear until around about the late 1600s. In fact, if you look at maps from around about 1630, there appears to have been quite a difference between the maps from just 5 or 10 years earlier. And what we see is not the Great Lakes as they're depicted today, but rather a large open section of water and several islands around the place. And it seems that there was a period of upheaval in the early 1600s, and things didn't actually settle down until the mid-1800s, which is the first time we see the Great Lakes actually depicted as they are today. Prior to this time, California is depicted as a peninsula. Then after the 1600s, California is depicted as an island, and a large lake, Lake Comets, is depicted as existing in the southern western United States. And then after the 1800s, California is no longer an island, and Lake Comets is missing, and the Great Lakes are depicted as they are today. Another really interesting thing is that on many maps of the United States from around about 1660 up until the mid-1700s show that the northwestern region of the North American continent, up into Canada and Alaska, is all very much unmapped. And yet on maps prior to the 1600s, you can see that the whole area has been quite well mapped. So that's another very interesting thing to take note of. And again, a great many of these maps depict California as being an island through this period. And again, it's not just one map or one particular cartographer that's doing this, it's a large number of them. And what this suggests is that there was some sort of cataclysm that happened in the early 1600s and another cataclysm that happened in the early to mid-1800s. And when you tie this in with the concept of the world being repopulated by children around about 1880, pieces of the jigsaw puzzle start falling into place. And if you really want to start looking into that story of the world being repopulated with children around about the late 1800s, circa 1880, then search for information regarding orphan trains and foundling homes in the late 1800s. You're going to find that there is an awful lot of information out there regarding the foundling homes that were so prevalent across Europe and the United States and in England and all over the world in the late 1800s, and just how many children were being collected and how many children were redistributed to other areas and sent to homes, and quite literally trainloads of children being sent out across the United States, shiploads of children being sent out to Australia, Africa and New Zealand. There was even a point when they had so many that they were holding baby raffles in France, and that was as recently as 1915. You'll find reports of over 200,000 children, or around about 200,000 children per annum, being shipped from east to west across the United States during this period as well. And as I mentioned on last week's show, when you look at some of the prison facilities here in Australia, such as Port Arthur, the jail cells are incredibly small. Some of them are so small you'd barely fit a cot in there. And when you consider the possibility that these were actually enclosures for children, it begins to make a great deal more sense. As uncomfortable as it is to consider the possibility, it really does seem to be what happened. And regarding the cataclysms, the reoccurring cataclysms and what may be the cause of this, and the fact that the Great Lakes were not there depicted on early maps of North America, this information comes from a friend of mine by the name of Steve Falconer. If you missed last week's show, because it was posted on my backup channel, because I had a penalty strike against this channel and was not able to upload for a week. If you missed that show, it is on my old AOD Scarecrow channel, but I will put a link to Steve Falconer's channel below, and there's a series that he's done called Comets, Cataclysms, Coincidence, And it really is worth having a look at, because that's another very striking thing when you look at reports from these areas. You find a massive amount of reports of comet activity in the skies. You find this comet activity is reported quite extensively through the 1600s and again through the 1800s at exactly the period when we were having grand solar minimums. And there is every indication that these grand solar minimums actually constitute periods of extreme upheaval on the Earth. And you've also got to ask yourself, how many comets would you expect to see in the sky? I mean, how often do we see a comet in the sky, folks? Or even a meteor shower or anything you could mistake for a comet in the sky? We really don't see that many. And yet, if you look at some of the reports from around the 1600s and 1800s, you find these comets are being reported like every couple of years, every couple of months sometimes. So you've got to wonder what this was really all about. Was it really comet activity, or was it simply some sort of electromagnetic plasma disturbances that were going on in the sky? And why would we see this comet activity right at these periods of the 1600s and of the 1800s, precisely when there were grand solar minimums, and precisely at the same period as all of the maps appear to have undergone an extreme amount of changes? You've got to ask the question, were the cartographers simply that bad that they didn't notice all these things? They didn't notice the Great Lakes sitting there next to Chicago, how they could put Chicago on a map but not the Great Lakes, but they couldn't see them or something. Were they really that bad that they got everything so wrong that they had to redraw the map so extensively after the 1600s and again after the 1800s? I mean, think about it, folks. It doesn't really make a lot of sense. But really, when you start putting all of the pieces of the puzzle together, the buried buildings, the mud flood, the changing of the maps, the grand solar minimums, the repopulating of the world with children. When you start considering all of these things, pieces of the puzzle really do begin to fall into place. It just depends on how willing you are to think outside the box and how much you're actually willing to consider. And again, forget about history, folks. Don't think you're going to find any of these answers in our modern day history, in what we're presented to as being history, because it simply isn't there, because the history that they're giving us simply isn't correct. And as I've said so many times, if you want any confirmation of that, all you've got to do is buy a plane ticket and get out there and travel around the world. And what you're going to find is that there's all these monuments lying all over the place, which tell a completely different story to what you're reading in books at school. The history we've been given is a pack of lies, folks, and that is completely confirmable by anybody who really takes the time to look. And I really do suggest that people do this, folks. It's very enlightening when you go out and just look at these monuments and just ask yourself a few questions. It's very, very enlightening. But folks, I think we have reached break time here, so I better leave it there for now, and we'll go and have a break. Thank you for joining me on the air today. It's always a pleasure to have your company, and I'll be back to speak to you again in a few minutes. Don't go away, because there's plenty more to come. And welcome back to the show, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, so it's an interesting realization to come to, the concept that history has been changed, history has been fabricated. It's rather a bitter pill for many people to swallow, but really when you look around the world, the evidence is there. And when you start factoring that in, and you start factoring in the reality that the timeline has been changed, as I've said, so many pieces of the puzzle fall into place, that it's literally a wonder we didn't start asking this question to begin with. Something else that I've mentioned before is the discovery of the language of Magyar, which appears to have been quite prevalent all around the world. You can find traces of Magyar in almost all cultures. Maybe not complete sentences, complete phrases, complete words, but you'll find traces of it there, which very much indicates that there is a connection. As I've said, the work of Attila Flink clearly identified Magyar as being the root language of the Australian Aboriginal, also of the Incas, of the Melanesians, of the Polynesians, and it appears to be the same with many other races around the world as well. And this is very significant, folks, because it shows there was once a worldwide root language, which also indicates that there was a worldwide culture that, again, we are referring to as Tartaria, for want of a better name, simply because Tartaria was the largest section we can find of this culture, the largest nation. Tartaria, in fact, took up Asia, Mongolia, Europe, Russia. A lot of areas on the European continent were, in fact, the one nation of Tartaria. And this seems to have gone out to also includes sections of the North American continent, the South American continent at times, and possibly even the Philippines and Australia. That's if the colours on the maps are anything to go by. The question is, what happened to it? It would appear there were a series of wars. It would appear the Napoleonic War, perhaps the War of Genghis Khan, even possibly the War of Troy were all interrelated, were all fought contemporaneously. Some of them, such as the War of Troy, was not thousands of years ago, as we were told. All of these wars appear to have been connected to each other and all related to the overthrow of Tartaria. But what really happened? What caused it? What was the big event that created the opening for these wars to happen? What was the big event, the cataclysmic event that created the mud flood? And are these events cyclic is the question. We find evidence of some sort of an event that happened in the early to mid 1600s. We find traces of another event that appears to have happened in the early to mid 1800s. The question is, were there events before that as well? Is there something that we can find in the 1400s? And of course, it's very difficult to go back and check because the maps, it's very difficult to find maps from pre-1500s. It's just very, very rare to find these things. There are the odd map you can find, but it's very difficult to gauge the accuracy of any of them, whether they actually depicted the lands as they were, because we simply don't have any other maps to compare them to. Like I said, you'll find one or two here and there, but they're generally very different from each other and generally quite localized to their own area. There's only a couple of maps we can find that actually appear to depict the entire world, and again, we don't know how accurate they are, simply because we don't have any other maps to compare them to, so we can't really see whether there were significant geological changes that happened. I mean, if the maps are anything to go by, of course there were, obviously there were, but as I said, we don't know how accurate these maps are, simply because we don't have any means of comparison. And there are, of course, many people who will say, well, look, you're not going to find any accurate maps from prior to the 1500s anyway, because people didn't have ocean travel in those times. There was no connection between the races of different continents and the peoples of different continents and blah, 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 and all the stuff that mainstream academic circles push, all of which appears to be completely inaccurate, because you can find traces that connect all of these cultures together. And folks, oceans were not something that separated people back in the old days. Oceans don't separate cultures. Oceans are more of a highway than a barrier. I mean, they've done journeys. Modern people have done journeys. There was a people back in the 50s or 60s when I was a kid. There was group of people who got a raft called the La Balsa, and they made a raft out of balsa wood, and they simply put it on the ocean currents, and they sailed to Australia from Indonesia somewhere. And you've had people that have done all sorts of tests, and they've just got rafts and they've put them on ocean currents, and they've wound up in other countries. Oceans are not a barrier. Oceans are a highway. The barriers are deserts. The barriers are areas where you can't find any food or water. This is not an ocean. You can take water with you on an ocean. You can catch fish. You can take food. You can get through on an ocean because you're constantly moving on the currents. If you're in a desert, then it's up to your own two legs to get yourself across. And if you don't have the means of hunting or gathering or collecting water along the way, then you will die. The deserts are a barrier. The oceans are a highway. And we've even found boats in Egypt, which are high-prow boats. We've found them in burial chambers, so we know that they had ocean travel. And so there's no reason to think that maps from prior to the 1400s would be completely inaccurate because they didn't have ocean travel, because the fact of the matter is that that's simply a false claim. But the interesting thing about it is the correlation between these changes on the maps that we see in the 1600s and in the 1800s, and the lack of sunspot activity, the solar minimums that happen at the same time. And then when we look at the charts for solar minimums, we can find that these events appear to happen around about every 200 years. And so, indeed, there would have been one of these events happen around the 1200s, and there would have been one around the 1400s, another one in the 1600s, another one in the 1800s, and we are due for another one very soon. We're actually entering into it this year, and it is set to be in full swing by 2040, 2050. And when you consider that, it sort of begins to make sense why the government would be pushing the concept of climate change. Getting people to expect there to be some significant changes in the climate and to trick us into believing that it's us that's causing it. The interesting thing about it, though, is what they're talking about, the main reference is global warming. And they're doing everything they can to cool the place down, to reduce carbon output, to push chemicals into the sky and block out the clouds and all the stuff that they're doing. But really, when you look at what we're heading for, which is a grand solar minimum, this is actually going to be something more akin to a mini ice age. And so with the effort the government is undertaking to cool the world down in preparation for this solar minimum, you've got to wonder how many people they're intending to exterminate with the next solar minimum. Because, what we should be doing, really, when you look at this, is finding ways to shelter ourselves from the cold and to hopefully warm the place up a little bit and make it more temperate, not to cool the world down in the face of what is coming. It really doesn't make a lot of sense. Not if you want to preserve the population. However, if you wanted to wipe out large sections of population and reduce the number of people alive on Earth, you would certainly be undertaking actions like this. So, it really does explain the actions of the politicians a little bit better as well. And even at the kids pushing for this now, big protests from the schools and all sorts of stuff, people wanting to reduce our carbon footprint. And after all, they do say they want to reduce the world to carbon zero. After all, that is the plan, isn't it? And when you think about it, folks, we are carbon-based life forms. Everything that we know is life, the trees, the birds, the animals, us, all of it is all carbon-based life. So what does a carbon zero world really look like, folks? You want to reduce the world to carbon zero? Well, what you're asking for is a world that is devoid of life as we know it. Think about it. Just think about the programs that they're putting into people and just how many people are in fact pushing for their own extinction without even knowing that they're doing it. Very clever, the way they get us to do this stuff, folks. And you think about all this stuff they've done, folks, the seed vaults they've created, the underground bases they've got, and the enormous amount of underground cities that we can find from the past. The recently discovered underground city in Turkey, which is a huge multi-level underground city with shops and houses and marketplaces and all sorts of stuff all underground. So it becomes very obvious that people who came before were aware of things that happened on the surface which were not very conducive to living on the surface, which would be, of course, why they lived underground. You're not going to be living underground by choice, not in something as large as this city that we see in Turkey. We all like to feel the sun on our skin, folks, Living underground would be a desperate move for any human being to undertake. So these places that we find are not simply matters of interest. They're not simply oddities. They're not simply curious. The effort that was taken to construct some of these places and the amount of people that they used to house is obviously a real reason that these places were there. And obviously they were there because life on the surface was too uncomfortable for people to endure. The question is why? What happened? And why aren't we taught any of this stuff? When you look at things as well, such as the Georgia Guidestones, which are there for those who come after, I would suggest to have a guideline to know that they cannot let the world exceed 500 million in population, because I think possibly the next event is going to be a little worse. What if these events get worse and worse every time? What if it's like that? What if it's something to do with consciousness as well? What if we get reduced in intellect, and with a reduction in intellect and a reduction in consciousness also brings a reduction in size of the next generation or the next incarnation of humanity, whatever you want to call it, the next cycle of humanity. Perhaps we change cycles every couple of 100 years. Perhaps the giants that we see the traces of that were around as recently as 100 years ago, perhaps these were left over from the previous cycle, and that would bring into question how big were the people before that cycle, and how often does it go back, and how far does it go back, and how huge was everything on this earth once? And is that loss of size related to a further compression of the atmosphere, a loss of CO2 in the atmosphere, a loss of consciousness, a loss of intellect. Is it all related? A loss of spirituality? Is the whole thing related? The entire human condition, there are so many aspects to it. It isn't just our physical. It isn't just what we eat. It isn't just what we think. There are all sorts of levels to this as well, beyond that. Our interaction with the atmosphere, the electricity in the atmosphere, the electricity in our bodies, the type of electricity we're using even. When you look at the free electricity that we used to have in a culture that was here prior to this one, the Tartarian culture, if that type of electricity was based on ethereal energy and the type of energy we're made from, perhaps that was very complementary for us to be around that type of energy. Whereas the electricity we're creating now, which is based on explosive technology, is very damaging to us. You can kill yourself by getting electrocuted. Perhaps this type of electricity is very damaging for the human organism, and perhaps it is in the summoning of this type of electricity which causes the decline that we see. Perhaps it is in the summoning of this type of electricity which causes these reactions that bring about the grand solar minimums. Who knows, folks? Who knows what the etheric connection between this earth and our consciousness and the sun really is? I know I'm getting into some pretty out there esoteric sort of thinking here, but what is the connection? If you think about how we could manifest reality with our minds, what is the connection of the collective consciousness to everything else that exists within this universe? Is it all connected? I would suggest that it is, by plasma strings or by the plasma itself, by the energy itself. If you can think of the space around you of not being empty, being full of energy, the prana that you see when you turn the lights off at night, that static electricity in the air, that energy, what if that energy itself is conscious, and it is that energy, that conscious energy that creates all matter, that creates us? We are bound to this energy. We are part of this energy. This is essentially the mind of God, or even God itself. That is the only way we can even view what God is as an energetic source, that static electricity we can see at night. What if that's what's going on here? And what if there is an effort to harvest that energy, harvest the human experience, harvest human consciousness? As I've said before, what if this is a soul test that we're involved in here? We're given everything possible to screw ourselves up in every way conceivable. It's all regarding the choices that we make. The choices that we make through this life, whether we choose to go down that path or whether we choose to walk the path of purity, walk the path of decency, walk the path of doing what is right. And another question that really must be asked when looking at all this technology that we use and everything that is happening to the human race right now, everything that's happening to the world right now, the question must be asked is, how many times have we done this before? How new is the technology that we're actually using? When I look at the legends and the stories of the scrying mirrors and the sigils for summoning demons and the stuff I've gone through so many times, when I look at the fact that these sigils all appear to be circuit diagrams, they all look like circuit diagrams, and that the cell phones, the mobile phones, the tablets, the laptops that we're using all appear to be scrying mirrors, I have to wonder, how many times has this happened? And were these stories left behind as warnings to us, to warn us of what these times bring about for those with eyes to see anyway, so that those with eyes to see would at least be able to take precautions against what is happening? It's an interesting thing too for the many Christians out there who believe that they are being good Christians, and yet it tells them in their teachings that they should not be supporting witchcraft, and yet here we have all of these people using all of these sigils and using these scrying mirrors every day. The scrying mirrors and the cell phones and the credit cards, this is the beast system, folks. But I just wonder, how old is this technology? Is it really new technology, or do they simply filter it out to us at the end of each cycle? Not only to keep us distracted, but to harvest the current zeitgeist of the human condition, to find out what everybody's thinking, to figure out exactly where they've taken human intellect at this time, just so they can correlate all the data for the next cycle. Again, looking at these maps and wondering how many times these cycles occur. Well, one thing that's interesting is the grand solar minimums that appear to happen at the same time that the maps change, and the reports of weird atmospheric disturbances. As I mentioned on last week's show, around the middle of the 1600s and the middle of the 1800s, we find an extraordinary amount of reports of comet activity. And as I said before, how often do you see a comet in the sky? It's not like these things are regular occurrences, so it's quite significant that we would see this much comet activity right at the time when these solar minimums were happening and right at the time when the maps have changed. Now, because it's very difficult to find accurate maps from around the 1200s and 1400s that give us any real clue as to whether there were Earth changes at the time, something we can look at is reports of weird disturbances at the time and see if there are any reports of strange atmospheric behavior around the 1200s and the 1400s. And when we look, what we find is, again, massive amounts of reports of an extraordinary amount of so-called comet activity in the skies in the 1200s and again in the 1400s, in fact through the 1300s as well, from the 1200s up until around about the late or mid 1400s. There seems to be an extraordinary amount of comet-related activity and strange atmospheric disturbances, exactly the way we see in the 1600s and the 1800s. And then it all sort of dies off, and there's no more reports of these strange atmospheric disturbances. So that's an interesting thing as well. And it would appear that there are strange atmospheric disturbances and what people are terming comet sightings that seem to happen on this Earth around about every 200 years. Another very interesting thing. And we know there have been massive depopulation programs that have been carried out on this Earth. We can just look at Bolshevism and see what happened there, which is an extremely disturbing part of human history, and yet it is there. We can find the remains of at least 6 million people just in a 2-kilometre section of tunnels under Paris. This is something that I also touched on previous shows. And the interesting thing about all of these bodies that are stacked up, femurs and skulls, and just stacked like rolls of parchment, and with skulls forming sigils in the walls in these Paris and catacombs beneath Paris. The interesting thing about them, folks, is that all of these skulls and femurs are very, very clean, like they've all been boiled. We're told that they simply relocated the cemeteries, but who would have done that? And imagine the gruesome job of digging up all those graves and relocating all those bodies and then stacking femurs and skulls in the walls. Where would be the point where you boiled all of these bones along the way? This is all very, very disturbing, folks, but we can find massive amounts of evidence all over the world which clearly indicates that our history is simply not what we're told. And like I said, when you really start looking into it, you can find evidence that there appears to be cyclic cataclysms and that our history has been completely fabricated. And that this has happened quite recently. Like we're just within the last couple of 100 years, within the last 150 years. When you start really looking into the stories of the orphan trains and the foundlings, and ask yourself, how many of your grandparents were orphans? How many of your grandparents were brought to countries and settled as orphans? How many of them were on orphan trains? These are questions we've never asked our grandparents. These are memories that go way back, and we just don't think about these sorts of things. It's not something that we ever considered because we've always considered the timeline to be true. We've just accepted it. We get to school and they teach us this certain stuff, and okay, this is the way the world is, this is why the world is the way it is, and this is what you have to do to find your place through it. And it's all based on economics and social standards and all sorts of stuff which are all purely to distract us. So much of this stuff is to distract us, folks. All this political theatre, all these wars, all this conflict, all of this stuff is being done to distract us. Even when you start looking at the theatre of politics, which is the Trump administration and all the stuff that's supposed to be coming from this and Q and all of this stuff, it's all a distraction, folks. All of the theatrics is a distraction. All of the governments are a distraction. none of what we believe to be important about this world is actually important, because none of it is focused on human consciousness, none of it is focused on the human condition, and ultimately, folks, we're being set up. We really are. When I look at our cities and I look at the way we've all been packed into these population centres and the way all of our societies are prefab, nothing's built to last. None of our structures, none of our skyscrapers, nothing is built to last. You've got to ask why that is. You know, when you look at the buildings from the old days, they were at least built to last. The buildings that we've got now, the real ones, the decent ones, were all built by previous cultures. Nothing that our modern cultures have built has been built to last. Nothing is designed to stay here, because I would suggest the people that run the whole show know full well that they don't have to build anything to last, because it's all going to be wiped out soon anyway. The question is, again, what causes it? What causes it? Even, when we look at last week, I was looking at the concept that there may have been oceans flooding across the continents. There's certainly times when that has happened, because you can look at the continental shelf and you can see the remnants of what appear to be great waterfalls and great rivers that once flowed from the continental shelf down into what is now deep ocean, because you can see the remnants of these things. But is that what causes the mud flood, or is it simply a plasma event? Is it something more to do with what is being reported as comet activity in the sky? Is there really something major and significant that happens that destroys the surface of this Earth every 200 years due to some type of cosmic cycle, some sort of sun-related activity that happens? Is that what causes? Is that why none of the forests on the Earth are older than around about 200 years? This is a question I've asked many times on the show. None of the forests, folks, even the Amazon rainforests, none of the major trees are older than 200 years. There's little pockets of old trees around the Earth, but they're all marked and catalogued. The question is, who even did that? As I said, folks, the world is not what we've been taught to believe, and the trick is getting to the bottom of the puzzle, finding out what the world really is. It's a big mission, and it's an ongoing quest, but I guess someone has to do it. And if we continue down this path, then I'm sure we will get to the correct answers eventually. The real trick I've always found is in actually asking the questions to begin with. And well, ladies and gentlemen, we have once again reached that time of the day where it is now the end of the radio show. It's kind of gone quickly for me today. I do enjoy talking about history. It's quite a fascinating subject, and whenever I start talking about it, the time seems to pass quite quickly. But that is it, folks. We have now pretty well run out of time. As I've mentioned to people recently, I'm going to be speaking at Anarchadelphia next weekend. So I'm not going to be bringing you a radio show next weekend, because I'm going to be in Philadelphia at a conference. If you are able to get to Philadelphia, I do look forward to catching up to you there. The shows are going to be a little bit intermittent over the next couple of months, folks, until the end of October, till I get home on October 22nd. I'm probably going to be bringing you a radio show likely every 2 weeks. I may get more than that done, but I'm really not sure. Like, I got this show done this week, but I will not be able to bring you a show next week because I'm going to be in Philadelphia. The following week, I will be in a motel in LA, and I can probably get a radio show done that week. But then the following week after that, on the 27th of September, I'm going to be speaking at Mount Shasta, so I'm not going to be able to get a show out for you that weekend. The following weekend to that, I will be attending a wedding. And then the weekend following that, I'm going to be speaking in Denver, Colorado. And that's an event that I'll be organising once I get to Philadelphia. I think it's going to be around about the 13th of October. I'm going to be speaking in Denver. So I've got next weekend in Philadelphia. Then I've got the 27th. I'll be speaking at Mount Shasta. And then on October 13th, I'll likely be speaking in Denver. So on those weekends and on the weekend of October 5th, I will not be able to bring you radio shows because I'm simply not going to have the means to do it. And that's actually like 3 weekends in a row. That's the 27th and then the 5th and the 13th I'm going to be unavailable. So that's actually 3 radio shows, 3 weeks in a row. So I'll do what I can to get you stuff in midweek between those shows. But I'll get as many shows out to you as I can between now and then, and we'll just see how it goes. And thanks for bearing with me through these rocky periods, folks, where I just don't get on the air. There might be a few interviews and a few things. I'll try to bring you a couple of snippets here and there. I might be able to do a few 5 or 10 minute clips and just post them anyway and say hi. We'll just see what happens. But thank you, as always, to all the people who send me so many kind emails. Thank you to all the people who post so many kind comments on my YouTube channel. Thank you to all the new subscribers on my channel. Thank you to those who support me on Patreon. I couldn't do any of this work if it wasn't for my Patreon supporters. And I will probably get a chance to answer a few emails while I'm away as well, while I'm spending some time in some motels and getting some downtime. I might be able to get a few emails answered, and that'll be a good thing as well. But thank you to all the people who continue to support the channel and continue to support the website. Thank you to all the people who send me so many kind words. But that is it for me, ladies and gentlemen. I've completely run out of time. I'll look forward to speaking to you again, not next week, but the week after. Please take very good care until then. In luck, cash.